episode of The Final Glass, where my husband and I chit chat about everything history. We have very different ideas about almost everything. And so the discussion might get a bit testy at times, sometimes more than others, but that just makes everything more exciting and also more likely to cover all of history's bases. It's like the show Crossfire, but history. And also, we're married and there's alcohol.
Like should have been on Crossfire. So our show gets its name from the Oscar Wilde quote: "After the first glass, you see things as you wish they were. After the second glass, you see things as they are not. And finally, after the final glass, you see things as they really are. And that is the most horrible thing in the world."
Terrible, terrible. We all need to keep our delusions. And speaking of, maybe you should quickly explain the attire.
Yes. So I try to wear our company branded clothing as often as I can. And my wife insists on turning up the lights very, very bright. And I had eye surgery. And so that's what the sunglasses are for.
Yeah, that's what you say.
Indeed.
So we are going to go ahead and start by describing our first drinks. And during the show, we may have surprise appearances from our cats, Maggie and Jadwiga. So don't mind them. They just like to be included in the discussion. And they also have very strong opinions. So would you like to introduce your drink first?
I will. First, I'm going to introduce Maggie, who was blocking my drink. So the first drink that I'll be having, actually all three, are going to be Gentleman Jack, which is a Tennessee whiskey, which is a type of bourbon that's been filtered additionally. So this is what I have.
And I have to say that that's the one that you use with the honey whenever I'm sick. So I don't know if it actually makes me better or if I just feel better.
So that's what I have.
So I decided to go with a little less basic than last week when I was all up with the Baileys and coffee, which, by the way, was delicious. So this time I decided I wanted to go with Cuba Libres. I love good rum. And I don't actually know if this is good rum, but it's good rum for me. And I also don't know how to pronounce it. So this is the problem when you get older like we are and you do all your drinking at home. You don't have a bartender to tell you how to pronounce the drink. And this is so good. We initially bought it to put in our glue wine when we were making that. And I really liked it. So I'm going to use it in my Cuba Libre today, which is Coke, of course, Coke and rum. So, na zdravia.
Cheers.
That's a really good Cuba Libre.
So the Gentleman Jack is kind of oaky on the nose. The body's kind of sweet, and the finish is rather buttery. So
can I smell it?
A perfect.
And I like it because it doesn't smell peaty.
Exactly. A perfect Tennessee whiskey.
And this rum is also super duper smooth, which is important to me because I really hate it when you drink something and have this afterwards. It makes me feel like an amateur, which I guess I kind of am. Anyway, back to the show. So this episode is actually going to be a two-parter. We were going to try to cover everything we wanted to cover in one part, but it turned out there's way too much to cover. So just recently, there was some news out of the U.S. that I thought was particularly interesting, and that's why we're covering what we're covering today. And that news was?
Yeah, the U.S. is going to restart nuclear weapons testing.
Well, it was signed that we should, and then they asked, to hurry it up, I guess. Yeah. But in any case, I thought this would be a good time to discuss nuclear weapons testing in history. And so, of course, if that's what we're doing, we are going to have to start with the Trinity test, which happened in 1945. in Alamogordo, New Mexico. And of course, this is something everybody knows about, right? And it's discussed. There was the whole Barbenheimer weekend, and everybody watched Oppenheimer. I really liked the TV series Manhattan. I thought that was a great one. Fantastic acting. And so I think in a lot of ways, this is retreading information for people. But I thought we would get a little bit more into the political ramifications of it rather than just talking about how big the bomb was. And it was big.
Yeah. It was a big bomb. I mean, we won't go through the specifications, Fat Man and Little Boy. But one of the main points was this was a rare piece of true secret collaboration between the UK and the US, which was penetrated by the Soviet Union. So it was an example of how countries which, you know, the US and the UK had been at war in the previous century. And now they were lashed so closely at the hip that they were developing the ultimate doomsday weapon together.
And we were super allies with the Soviet Union, but we didn't tell them that we were doing this. But okay, so let's start a little closer to the beginning. So the 1930s was this time of like huge leaps forward in the whole nuclear development stuff, right?
Yeah, based on the work of Marie Curie,
and then her daughter and her son-in-law, I think every parent's dream is to have this super smart dynasty, like the Curies.
But not to die by radiation poisoning.
No.
Or a wagon.
Okay, yeah, that's true as well. But moving forward from that, so in the 1930s, there were just so many discoveries, including in 1938, they discovered nuclear fission. And this was actually discovered in Germany.
Yes.
Right? And so that's going to be in the back of your mind as you're developing nuclear weapons during World War II, right? Oh my gosh, the Germans discovered fission. They must be further ahead than we are in developing this ultimate doomsday device. So all of these discoveries actually led to the Soviets figuring out that the US was working on a weapon.
And the thing that stunted ultimately the German super bomb, the German nuclear weapon, was the fact that Hitler made declarations that all weapons testing and all weapons development had to be immediately applicable on the battlefield. And so developing a nuclear weapon was not a quick thing. It wasn't to turn around of a few months. And it took a tremendous amount of resources. And so essentially the Germans had dropped out of the project.
Right, but we didn't know that.
Yeah.
Because of course, concurrent to that, the Germans were working on this ultimate missile, right? The V2.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a missile, it's a rocket, right?
So both the V1 and the V2 were actually what we would consider rockets because they were unguided, because guidance hadn't been developed at the time. So they were essentially fired at a certain speed, at a certain angle, with a certain amount of fuel, and that's how they got to their targets.
And it's actually one of my favorite stories. This is a total tangent here, sorry, but one of my favorite stories of courage in World War II was that this was actually the Polish Home Army that was able to get this missile that had not gone where it was supposed to and get it from this occupied area across a bunch of occupied Europe to the UK, where we were able to really figure out what was going on with this rocket. So total tangent. Let's go back to the Trinity testing.
So the Trinity testing. The Trinity testing of the Manhattan Project eventually led to a nuclear explosion. The U.S. ended up coming up with two devices, one of each type, and ended up dropping them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time that the U.S. was developing these weapons, a tremendous amount of strides were being made in Europe to try to prevent the Germans from developing these weapons, not knowing that the Germans had essentially dropped out already.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole where it came down to the testing and where it came down to the deployment of the nuclear weapons to Japan was as much of almost as much theater as it was science. So, for instance, the testing was done on July 16th in 1945, and on July 17th, Truman was supposed to be in Potsdam for the now famous Potsdam Conference. So Churchill was there. Churchill, of course, knew about the weapons testing because the British scientists were also working on it with the Americans. And Stalin, to all American understanding, didn't know. So Truman, there was some discussion within the administration about whether Stalin should know and how much Stalin should know. People came down on different sides of that. But Truman decided that he should tell Stalin something. And so he kind of informally walked over to Stalin during a meeting and said, hey, you know what? We just tested the biggest bomb that has ever been bombed in the history of bombs, and it's huge. And Stalin was like, oh, that's great. You should use it.
Yeah.
So that was the day after the testing when that went down. And then, of course, it was less than a month until Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. And the theater about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think, played to explained maybe, a very important part of the Russian psyche that I think still today the West is just not fathoming. And maybe you can explain it.
That was the desire and ability to lie about absolutely every part of every development and non-development in a military or civilian.
Absolutely, theater. Absolutely. But I think even more than that, there was one further thing in that when the bomb exploded over Hiroshima, Stalin's thought, right, was...
Well, yeah, Zhukov and then Stalin, their thoughts were that this was a threat to the Soviet Union. Never mind that Stalin had insisted that the weapon be used as quickly as possible.
Well, yes, and never mind that, we were at war and we wanted to end the war. But I think that comes down to another issue that is historic within the Russian Empire that the West also has trouble fathoming, which is just there is a very different calculation on life.
Yeah, and the idea that more than 500,000 troops would likely be casualties from the invasion of the Japanese home islands wasn't even a factor in the Soviet Union.
Right. Look what they had done just in Stalingrad alone.
Yeah, overall they had suffered 20 million casualties. And so an extra 500,000 casualties would have been a rounding error. And so Stalin considered the lack of invasion either cowardice or a short-sightedness or all sorts of problems with the American psyche that they couldn't couldn't withstand a mere over 500,000 casualties for something that could be done with a bomb alone. And so despite the fact that he said, hey, detonate the bomb, then when the bomb was detonated, he said, oh, this has got to be a threat to me.
Yeah, this is obviously aimed at Russia, not the place where the bomb actually exploded, because why would it be?
Yeah.
So that was a big difference, and that was kind of how the Soviet Union started. So we didn't actually admit, it wasn't until a few days after we bombed Japan, the US bombed Japan, that it was admitted that the test had happened. So I thought, and there's an interesting corollary between this and when the Soviet Union does their first nuclear test as well. So when this bomb was exploded, it was daylight for miles and miles and miles. It was so massive and huge. There was no ignoring that this had happened. And yet the US, knowing that nobody had the information to understand what had just happened, said, oh, no, we just had a massive magazine accidental explosion in New Mexico. Oops. That was the explanation at the time.
And the truth was that despite all of their calculations and the slide rules and the estimations, no one really knew what the bomb was going to do. So a significant number of people thought that the effects would be essentially to set the atmosphere on fire.
Yes, yeah. Enrico Fermi was actually taking wagers on whether just New Mexico would burn or the entire world, which didn't help a lot of people's confidence.
And so it created a question of, let's test it first and then see how we're going to lie about it, rather than, hey, let's set up a lie beforehand and then let's test the weapon.
Yes, absolutely. And but it was done, and it was done much more secretly than expected, except it also wasn't. So the one person that the US and Britain really kind of wanted to be surprised by this, other than the Japanese, of course, would have been the Soviet Union, because it wasn't something we wanted to share with them. But it turns out they really weren't. And the way that they figured out that this program was going on in the US is actually a fantastic story in itself. So let's go ahead and do our second drink, and then we can talk about how things were not.
So, to how things
were not. This is really smooth. I really like this lemon. I think you bought it because it was on sale.
I did.
It was a good sale. I wish it was still on sale. We're going to be done with it soon. Okay. So, how the Soviets figured out the US was working on a big nuclear project is actually leading into the Soviet nuclear weapons testing in 1949. So there was one big tip-off. Stalin actually was not working heavily on developing a nuclear weapon until 1942, when he received a letter from one of his physicists that said, hey, we should be working on a uranium bomb. And the reason, do you remember the reason that
It's because the US went quiet as
Yes.
far as their own development of uranium, both weapons and other practical applications. And that indicated to an analyst, somebody who wasn't even a professional analyst, but that something was going on.
Yeah, and to me that's interesting, because this is like the only time, or maybe the second time in history, that the Slavic tendency for conspiracy theories actually played out, right?
Yeah, and paranoia. But that's exactly what was going on in New Mexico, as we know now.
Yeah, everything had become classified. So you could no longer do nuclear research and publish it so that everybody could see. The US was working on this thing. They didn't want anybody to catch up just now. So they quieted down. And so in 1942, this scientist sent the letter to Stalin. And Stalin was like, hey, yeah, you know what? My conspiracy brain's kicking off too. Let's see what we can do with this. And then about 1943 was when the spy rings in the United States really, and the UK really started to get some momentum. And that is, of course, Klaus Fuchs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And side note, Klaus Fuchs is actually buried in Berlin. So if anybody wants to visit the grave of Klaus Fuchs, there is a cemetery in Berlin where it's very socialist. Most of the socialists are buried. Rosa Luxemburg is buried there as well. Klaus Fuchs's grave is there. So interesting side note on that.
So as part of the Soviet constant deception and constant lying campaigns, and we're not sure if this is true to this day, but one of the quotes from Stalin was that if we develop these kind of weapons, and if people have these kind of weapons, it's going to be the end of war. It was, of course, not the end of war. And anyone who believed that simply having a wonder weapon like this, when everybody else had them, would cause the end of war was probably delusional, or such an optimist that they would probably be shot in the Soviet Union.
Yes. Well, I will say that was his initial reaction the day after the Hiroshima bombing. Because in 1946, I think it was February of 1946, Stalin, the Soviet Union actually had elections, but only Stalin was ever running. So he was giving a re-election speech at the Bolshoi. And he said, well, World War II was caused by capitalism. And as long as capitalism exists, we're going to have another world war. So he basically kind of went the Mother Russia route during World War II to get everybody fighting to save the motherland. And then after the war was over, he went full communism again. Mm-hmm. we're going to have more 5-year plans. We're going to have to buckle down and do this. And everybody in Russia is exhausted. But I think by that time, so beat down, what do you do? How do you argue?
Yeah. And he basically admitted more of you are going to starve in order for us to develop this weapons program.
Well, he didn't say it was a weapons program, though. He just
Yeah.
referred to it as, but it was the weapons program that was
But to
going
develop
on.
these technologies, to develop the science, in order for the West not to conquer us so that you won't have to starve. So the elements of sacrifice were in direct contradiction to the fact that the colonialists will come take us over and force us to sacrifice.
Yes. It was a very Stalinist way to do it. So a few weeks ago, we discussed what happened on Christmas Day in the Soviet Union. And, I actually left one very important thing out, which was it was on Christmas Day in, I believe, 1946. That was the first time the Soviet Union was able to create a nuclear chain reaction. So from then on, they went full forward in developing because they did not want the U.S. to have this advantage. In fact, they wanted to have the advantage over everybody else. So their first nuclear reactor went, so the term has reached criticality. And as a not physicist, I have no idea how to describe that to anyone.
But the reaction is self-perpetuating.
Yeah, I was going to say, that means it's working.
Yeah.
So that happened
well,
in 1946. Well,
it's working out of control.
It's working out of your control,
out
not
your
out of
control.
control like it's going crazy.
Yeah, like out of your control. It's no longer, you're no longer able to stop it. So what's going to happen is going to happen.
Okay, which is a very Slavic way to look at things, I think.
It is.
So that happened in 1946, Soviet Union's moving forward, but they had an advantage that actually saved them about 2 years on development. And that, of course, came from the fact that they had all those spies in the American/British program.
Mm-hmm.
And those spies delivered the full-on blueprints to one of the bombs to the Soviet Union,
mm-hmm.
which, of course, allowed them to bypass a lot of the dangerous testing and led to their first bomb,
mm-hmm.
which was basically an exact replica of the U.S. plutonium bomb.
Yeah.
And the name?
Russia does it itself.
Yeah, RDS-1.
Yeah.
RDS-1. Russia. So how would you? Russia?
Делает сама.
Sama. Okay.
Does it itself.
Which it didn't.
It did not.
It absolutely did not.
But that's part of the deception program.
Exactly.
It's part of their desire and ability to lie in all circumstances on all topics.
Yes. So, and that actually, they thought that they were getting away with something when they tested it because they didn't realize one very important thing, which was
the fact that
we could sense it,
detect it.
Yeah, they had no idea that we had detection capabilities. And the detection capabilities were actually new. They set off the bomb in August of 1949. Our detection program came out in spring of 1949. So it was just right before. And it was picked up by a plane. And the planes were run by the Air Force Weather Service. So I'm not quite sure why they chose to run it through the Weather Service. Maybe you have a better idea than I do.
It's just reconnaissance aircraft, no matter who's flying them.
Okay, but and I guess the weather aircraft have an excuse to be flying around those areas.
Yeah.
So they picked up, so first we detected seismological activity. And okay, that happens, earthquakes happen, right? But then the test was August 29th. We detected activities, we detected radiological material on September 3rd. And then we cross-referenced that and went, oh, I guess the Soviets have the bomb, which was way sooner than expected.
So there were a lot of timelines and a lot of questions about when the bomb would be developed. The most reasonable, a lot of people who were perhaps asleep at the switch thought that it would take 20 years, but most reasonable people thought that it would be between 50 and 53. So it came in 49. It came a little bit earlier than the more alarmist estimates, but quite often when dealing with the Soviet Union, the alarmists have been correct.
Yes. And side note on this, I actually think, we found out after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s that this missile race, this bomb race, this weapons race that we had been having all of this time, we had always been ahead. It was not.
Their effective
Yeah.
deception campaign ran both ways. So on one hand, it deceived the people of the Soviet Union into thinking that it was a much stronger country than it was. But on the other hand, it drove the US to develop new technologies faster, to spend more money in order to try to get ahead of what they perceived to be a missile gap, when in reality, there really wasn't a missile gap.
And I think that was a reaction. A lot of that was also a reaction to having been so wrong about when the Soviet Union was going to get the bomb. After Stalin gave that speech in 1946, it sounded like he was like, all right, there's going to be war. It sounded like he wasn't saying it, well, we can't change it. It sounded like he was promising it. And so I can see how the analysts who said, 50, 53, somewhere in there, we still got some time, didn't want to make that mistake again.
And the other issue was the uranium. The U.S. was assumed to be the biggest source of uranium and really the source of pure uranium necessary for weapons.
We thought we had a monopoly on it.
We thought we had a monopoly on it. But in reality, the Soviet Union had a lot of low-grade uranium, which required a lot more processing. It required a lot more work to get Soviet uranium to work. But in the end, it worked.
It did. But even going beyond that, the Soviets were able to find their own sources of uranium. They were able to get past these other hurdles. They had our plans, so they had an easier time moving forward on some things. They had another additional thing that we knew about, but we didn't quite place, which was they kidnapped about 2,500 German scientists and technicians working on rockets and working on nuclear things and took them to the Soviet Union. And the initial story was that they volunteered, which of course a lot of them did not, and that they had all come from the East Germany, which was also not entirely true. It turns out the Soviets went into the other sectors and grabbed some people that they thought were particularly important and they couldn't live without. But nobody wants to start another world war over some German scientists.
It was the Soviet version of Operation Paperclip, which was the U.S. bringing back a lot of German scientists, a lot of fledgling Nazi scientists, and putting them to work in U.S. weapons programs. The Soviets did the same thing. So one of the interesting things was that this program was misidentified by the CIG and by the tailing elements of the OSS as they were being decommissioned. And so the program, the Soviet name for the program was the Voluntary Guest Worker Program. So they simply, if someone points a gun at you,
it doesn't need a name. They just do it all the time anyway.
Yeah, it doesn't need a name. But it was voluntary scientific worker program. So these were scientists that were transferred, which is a logical name for it. So the CIG and the tailing elements of the OSS got it in their heads that this was part of OSA Sovyakiem, which was actually an association started in the 1920s for Soviet citizens who were interested in learning about defense, aviation, and chemicals.
So it's like their version of CAP.
It's their version of CAP, exactly.
Yeah.
And so these were a lot of sports clubs, and these were people who developed shooting programs for pilots and shooting programs against pilots, basic chemical weapons defense. Civilians, yeah. This is a civilian program. So it really had nothing to do with this guest worker program. But for some reason, it just kind of took on. Guest worker program, yeah. But for some reason, it took on kind of a life of its own, and that's what it became known as. Even though that association had dissolved, right, and had moved into 3 different Soviet associations, one with people who are interested in defense, one for people who are interested in aviation, and one for people who are interested in chemistry. And so it had nothing at all to do with nuclear weapons or nuclear scientists or
The
any
things
of this.
get turned around
But
and lost
things
in
get turned around and
translation.
lost in translation, exactly. So the society itself had dissolved. Now, years and years later, it came back together in some other form. But at the time that this program, this guest worker program was happening, it had been dissolved and changed into something different.
So it is cracking me up that you keep calling this a guest worker program.
They were guests.
They were guests. I mean,
guests of the state, yes.
Okay, the way, like a convict is a guest.
Exactly the way that a prisoner is a guest.
Yeah, so...
Yeah, it was a prisoner program, but it had nothing to do with what the name was, but for some reason the name stuck. The Soviets never used that name themselves because they already had something by that name. It wouldn't have made any sense.
Well, yes, but in addition to that, they just weren't referring to this German program in general because they didn't want to talk about the fact that they had used former Nazis to implement their program as well. And my favorite part of this whole story is that, and this is favorite in a very dark humor sort of way, but is that one of the reasons that this, as you said, guest worker program had to be implemented is because the main Soviet scientist, who was the father of basically Soviet spacecraft design, and he was a rocket engineer, they couldn't find him. He was in a gulag somewhere. So it took them quite a while to figure out where this brilliant guy was being held, and they went to go get him. And of course, he lived the rest of his life worried that he was going to end up in the gulag again or killed because of his state secrets. But that is probably the single most Soviet situation I have ever heard of.
Yeah.
So
they needed it because they had prosecuted their own people. But the Germans also had some genuine advances. And another reason was to deny those same scientists to the US and to the UK and to the French.
Absolutely. So, and they wanted to hide it because they were actually making quite a lot of hay out of Operation Paperclip and how the US used Nazis later in our scientific programs. They made quite a lot of political hay out of it as they did the same thing.
Yeah, they did the same thing and worse.
Yeah. So anyway, so we get to the test. The Sovs test in Kazakhstan. The US detects it. They didn't realize that we've detected it. They're not mentioning that a test has happened. And so on September 23rd, President Truman says, let's beat him to the punch. And he makes a televised address where he says, it looks like the Sovs have tested a nuclear weapon. Mm-hmm. We have detected it. The Soviets didn't know we had this ability to detect nuclear tests. So that shocked them. And it took them 2 days to figure out how they were going to respond. And they responded by using, I think, it's my second most favorite phrase that people who are hiding things use, which is, we can neither confirm nor deny that this happened. It was just a big explosion. We had a big giant mining explosion. That's what you heard. That's what you detected. We're not going to say we have the bomb. We're not going to say we don't have the bomb. We may have had the bomb since 1947. You don't know. But that was their reaction. And this is when Truman authorized it was the hydrogen bomb, right?
Yeah.
Thermonuclear research started to go forward.
So the difference between fission and fusion. Fusion makes a bigger bomb.
Fusion makes a bigger bomb.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have expected that. You would think that when you end up with more, you would have bigger.
Yeah, but the force of creating fusion.
But also, like, the bomb is big enough that at what point does it...
Yeah, at what point does it cease to matter?
It cease to matter?
Yeah.
And so by this time in 1949, the Truman Doctrine was well and truly already being implemented. We already were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so history played out from there.
The U.S. was penetrated utterly by Soviet spies, was penetrated by communist
nuclear program certainly was.
The nuclear program was.
And because that's what we're talking about right now, but the nuclear program certainly was. There were so many, and not just the U.S., because we can't forget the Cambridge spying, Kim Philby. My most hated spy that I get obsessed with reading about. And what I thought was interesting, I didn't know this previously, but when I was kind of gathering together the stuff so we could talk about this, I saw that there were actually Soviet scientists who were working in the lab researching at Cambridge University in the 1920s and 30s. So I wonder if there were any connections between that, but you do not agree with me there.
No, the Soviets had incredibly stovepiped intelligence programs to the point where it's quite frequently some of the agents didn't know about each other, even though they met each other, and even the handling officers didn't understand it. So it was excellent compartmentation because they were trying to protect their sources.
So I think this is one of the places where I, who am not a Slav, am possibly more Slav than you.
Yes.
Because I see this
You
thing
see
and that's
more-
possibly
more-
in the background.
More conspiracies.
Yeah,
perhaps,
exactly.
Than there actually were.
Exactly. So shall we do our final glass? Prost.
To see things as they are.
It has really good rum. You're going to have to knock back the whole thing before you see it as they are.
I do.
The whole thing.
You have to finish the.
So how about
finish the glass. So my impressions are that they'll always be with all these technologies, especially with cutting edge technologies like nuclear weapons. There'll always be people who develop, and there'll always be people who imitate. And the ones who imitate save a lot of money on research and development, but they'll never be on the cutting edge of whatever we're dealing with. So in this instance, the Soviets never did catch up, and never did surpass us. They never did create a missile gap because the technologies that they quote unquote developed themselves, they had actually stolen from us. And that prevented them having those building blocks, helped them build the previous thing, but it prevented them from developing the latest thing. And so the US was always ahead. But their propaganda and their deception and their lies were so effective that the US consistently thought it was behind.
So my final thought is actually a thought for the future, the present and the future, and not necessarily a thought about the past, but it is created by the past. And that is that we seem to have in the West an absolute inability to process how the Slavic world, and in particular Russia, thinks. We are just absolutely unwilling to listen to people who know what this thought process is. And as a result, we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I mean, even Reagan's favorite quote in 1980, the most famous one, trust but verify. I would go so far as don't trust, definitely verify. Don't trust, because there's this idea that has always been, it was there in the Russian Empire under the Tsars. It was certainly there under the Soviet Union. I believe it's still there now, which is you tell people what needs to be said in order to do whatever the hell you want to do behind the scenes. It doesn't matter what you say in public. You're going to do what you're going to do. And we seem to be unable to internalize that.
And I think the final corollary to that is that it often backfires.
It does.
On the Soviets, on the communists, and on the Tsar. A lot of the legends that they spread weren't true. And
led to the just collapse of the 90s.
Collapse of the 90s, but collapse after World War I. And it was when the propaganda of the refrigerator defeated the propaganda of the television. So the television told people they're happy, everything's healthy, everyone's refrigerator's stocked. But when you open the fridge and you didn't see anything, that trumped the television. And so I think the same thing happened over and over again in that part of the world, that the propaganda of the television is excellent, but the propaganda of the refrigerator is undefeatable.
And I think that's true. And I think that is a very good way to kind of figure what's going to happen coming forward. But the problem we have to worry about right now, that history is telling us time and time again to worry about, is that going to happen in time? And why can we not listen to people who know what this thought process is and stop this problem before it becomes an even bigger problem, an even more deadly problem? So Until next week, when we will discuss the second half of the history of nuclear weapons testing. To the final glass.
To the final glass. Oh, mine's empty.
What to do?